William. I work with Beth and her amazing team. I want to just quickly go through some intros and we'll kind of get things going with a few questions, but really just want to get into a conversation, like a nice flow with folks. The things that we've prepared to ask are probably not the things that line up directly with what you're interested in learning from the panelists. So it'd be better if you steer the conversation rather than I try to steer the conversation. Although I do have some great questions if that's what we want to do. So let me just start by turning over to Eric, let him introduce himself.
Yeah, Eric Lowe. I'm pinch hitting for someone apparently, but happy to be here. So I'm usually based in Los Angeles. I am self-employed at the moment, but around December was when I left Booz Allen as the head of strategy for space and growth. There, I focused my time on strategic alliances, M&A, and corporate ventures. Prior to that, I also did a lot of business development on behalf of Booz Allen for national security and civil space focus procurements. Background is in electrical engineering, not much of an engineer anymore, but really just trying to use my tech background, but also investment background to help companies grow. So I've been doing that for the last 10 or 15 years, advising, mentoring startups. Good to be here.
Thanks, Eric. Steve?
So I'm Steve Kaplan. I am a lawyer here at Pillsbury, and I work mostly with kind of tech companies. There's, I'd say, plurality maybe in the kind of defense space, kind of critical infrastructure, but it's not a specific focus. Represent some VCs, including your prior employer in their venture capital deals, as well as some kind of traditional VCs. The firm generally is, 700 lawyers across, 4 or 5 countries, 16 offices, kind of a full service platform with the focus on tech companies, not exclusively. So I personally help with fundraising, M&A, and kind of corporate governance, but my colleagues kind of handle everything that tech companies need.
Thanks, Steve. Jarrett?
Hey, everybody. My name is Jarrett Corson. I'm with Leonid Capital Partners. We are a credit investment firm working specifically with companies who operate on government contracts. So we really look at government contracts or really government revenue, right, as an off-book asset that we can lend against. We look at that as the underwritable base. And the point really being to help teams align their costs with those dollars flowing in from the government, right? Obviously, a lot of teams have to put infrastructure in place, whether that's hiring engineers, renting out warehouses, doing R&D, testing, et cetera. And that's pretty capital intensive on the front end of these contracts, where the contract milestone payments may not be for 6 months, for 8 months, and teams are kind of just left stranded trying to, connect the costs up front and the revenue coming in from the government at a later date. And then who knows, maybe even the government decides to shut down for a couple months and it pushes it back even further.
Hypothetically.
Yeah.
In theory, of course.
We'll never know what happens when the government shuts down. But yeah, okay, great. This is awesome. Very excited to have you guys here. Let's start off. Actually, you said something really awesome and very thought-provoking, Stephen. It'd be interesting to kind of test this out because space is it's one of the only real dual-use markets that exists. You said dual use is a myth.
I asked you to finish the sentence.
Finish the sentence.
Dual use is a myth because, or dual use is a reality because.
Yes. Okay.
I think there's arguments to be made in both of those.
Yes. So let's start there. Why don't you give us one of your 2 answers, and we'll round out with the other 2.
All right. I'll start with, because we're here in space. I actually think this is one of the industries where dual use. So stepping back from dual use, no company is going to be dual use on day one. I think it's harder to do. So normally you start in one and transition to the other. And I think space actually is one of the areas that has a very natural start in government, have opportunity to transition to commercial. Right now, not a ton of companies have made that, but everyone expects there'll be more and more companies making that jump. So I think in an industry where the end users aren't, and so again, think of space. The end users are themselves very large companies, some of which have budgets larger than some countries. So the idea that they can provide commercial services to those customers is very possible. And then there is, again, what you're seeing in some of the, so again, commercial space as launch, as build, things like that, as opposed to actually providing services. A few companies have been successful at providing kind of actual commercial level services to either industry and a couple of examples to individual consumers. I have to assume, right, there's a big conference going on this week that's betting on that continuing. Dual use is a myth because I think it's really hard to build a product for the commercial sector and then directly take it into many government uses. We were talking about, there's a whole industry of VARs, value-added resellers, that exists solely to translate kind of commercial software into the government. Now, is that dual use? I mean, I guess arguably it is. You're selling it commercially, but you're also selling it indirectly to the government. But I don't think, again, we mentioned, Dell thinks of themselves as a dual use company. They just happen to sell a whole lot of hardware to the government because the government has lots of employees that work on laptops. So is that maybe that's not a myth as much as a misstatement.
I want Eric to challenge you in some way, though.
I said a lot to be challenged.
Yeah.
I think when we're talking about space, most of the time, yes, government is going to be the first customer. I have seen quite a few examples where these companies have been able to turn the corner, I should say, and actually sell to commercial. Not many. And then if you actually count the revenue breakdown, it might still be 80% government and 20% commercial. But then some companies have done that. There are a few Earth observation companies that have been able to do that, Planet being, part of that group. Other companies are doing space tugs, like to service satellites when they are running out of fuel and about to deorbit or whatever. That's another area where I'm seeing that there's a strong demand for both, for that type of service from both government and commercial customers. I mentioned earlier that Booz Allen invested in 3 companies. I would say all 3 companies are dual use companies. I wouldn't actually make the recommendation to the CFO that we want to go and invest in those companies if they are only supporting the government. Because I think, while we are strategic investors, first and foremost, I do want to make sure that we make money towards the end of the day, right? So, if you're not looking at both commercial and government, it's just
maybe a little bit closer.
Okay, then it's going to be a problem when it comes to market sizing. So Starfish is one of the 3, and they're providing commercial space tug for both commercial SATCOM companies, but also government entities, for example. So I think I would like to see the balance between commercial revenue and government revenue to be more even. But I would say that dual use is working to an extent in space.
I don't want to say your job, but I have a question I want to hear the answer to. How do you think your answer on dual use with respect to space will be different in 5 years? You said kind of right now, some turn the corner, still 80% government, 20% commercial. Is that a durable answer, or is that an answer that's going to be completely different in 5 years?
And I wish I know the answer, factually. I think there are some areas of space where there's a potential for that. Space domain awareness, for example, is not a new topic, but because of all the mega constellations being in space right now, it's becoming more urgent topic for both commercial and government space users. And so I think that's one where monitoring, whether that's space domain awareness or local domain awareness of debris, rocket bodies, other satellites, even bad guys in space, that is important for basically just all users. So I would think that one, for example, will be an example of.
Jared, what's your take on this?
So I think something Eric said is really interesting, and I actually disagree a little bit. Granted, we don't solely operate in the space sector. It's really anywhere within the defense industry. But he was mentioning, right, some companies are, say, 80-20 government to commercial revenue, and he would like to see it be a little bit more even at times. for us, and this again, this extends well past the space, just the space industry, really. But having companies that know what their core business is and are really, really good at that, and then try and find natural progressions into whether they're a commercial company and finding natural progressions into the government space, or they're primarily working with the government and they're finding natural progressions into the commercial space, is so much more effective than them trying to juggle things, trying to juggle being both commercial and government, and trying to grow and scale, and trying to, handle all of these things at once. It just ends up being too much for a lot of companies that we come in contact with. So it's, and again, not just space, it extends well past that, but really knowing what you're good at and excelling at that, and then starting to go and find natural progressions into other ventures is really what we found to be very effective for teams that we work with.
That's a great point. I think it kind of reminds me that you can have it all, but you can't have it all at once. It's kind of what you're saying there. Let me try to connect that to something that you mentioned, Eric, and then see kind of how this stimulates the conversation. So thinking as a corporate VC who does care about outcomes, because there are corporate VCs who financial outcomes are not what drive them. You mentioned the value of dual use, and you talked about market sizing. And I think you're solving for different things, right, Jared, than somebody who's looking for a venture outcome. I just want to unpack this a little bit, because venture has become the fuel of choice for companies recently. It seems like everybody thinks they should be raising venture capital. And I'd love to hear your collective thoughts on how to balance the idea of finding the right kinds of capital, the right kinds of fuel for your business, knowing that the ideal fuel is fuel from customers, but there's also other partners that you want to work with, and whoever wants to pick that up.
Okay. So I'll first talk a little bit about the financial motivation versus strategic motivation. I would say, yes, we have a little bit of a balanced approach as opposed to we're just a strategic investor. But I think for us to care about the companies wanting to get into both commercial and government, it's not just about market potential, right? It's also about them being able to be successful and sustain itself as a company. So, we're all experiencing, disruptions to government funding, government shutdown, furlough, all of it, right? So if you're just betting on one customer giving you money and that only, well, that obviously is going to be troublesome for the survival of the company. So that's kind of how I think about it. Not solely like just doing like how many X's we're creating.
Like a risk of like you have one customer.
You're syndicating the risk. Yeah. And then the question about, please remind me of the second question.
So just thinking about the right kinds of capital stack for somebody who's running a business.
Gotcha. So I would say, as an angel investor, as a corporate investor, I actually would highly encourage entrepreneurs to think about other sources of capital. Venture debt, I don't know, grants, direct investment from someone with like a totally different types of terms than a traditional VC will give you. I think that's critical, particularly if for certain companies and the trajectory that they want to go on as far as the growth, sometimes VC money wouldn't make sense because of the timeline for VC money. I don't actually really want the entrepreneurs to give away too much equity anyways, right? So for like one example will be, I'm building material science products for space. And maybe once you actually invent the initial article product, all you have to solve is manufacturing and scaling and being able to pump that out. And so in that case, I think it's a lot more predictable of a growth path to where you should go and talk to a bank and try to actually raise some debt as opposed to giving away your very valuable equity. In my opinion, I think it's underused. And I'm teeing up for you.
Yeah. He touched on almost every point I was going to make as well, which is really, you have to find the right fit for the capital that you're looking for at any given time. It's not I think a lot of companies get so wrapped up in any time they need money. It's just, let's just go raise more equity, more equity, more equity. And it's okay. We just finished our last round. It was a year-long, 9-month process. So relieved to be done. Next week we're starting raising again. That's great, but it's just giving away more equity, taking on more equity dollars isn't always the answer. And like Eric mentioned, whether that's you can go to a bank at times, you can look for federal grants, right? You can use resources like Leonid to provide the appropriate types of capital at the appropriate time for companies. And kind of where we were really born is that when companies are in early stages, right, and they have these contracts, but they might not have a ton of outside revenue, right? They might some banks don't look at government contracts as revenue, right? They don't recognize it as revenue. They don't even recognize it as an asset. So it's tough for companies to even go to a bank at that time and try and take out a loan to be able to get some working capital or to continue to grow and scale. And that would be a great time for us to come in. There's also very appropriate times throughout the life cycle of a company to go to, whether it's VC dollars, whether it's venture debt, whether it's go to a bank, right? It really is about the right type of capital at the right time.
My turn. I think I'm having a bit of a out-of-body experience. So I'm normally the one lawyer on a panel with VCs trying to explain why you shouldn't take venture capital, and they're all trying to say how amazing their money is. And so I'm going to defend venture capital, which is not what I normally do. So again, if this was a room full of kind of mostly, software companies, I would probably say, build your business to profitability, run it for as long as you can until the next guy comes and does something better really quick, rather than trying to raise money and build a moat. But that's not what you guys, I assume, because we're here in the space panel. I actually think venture capital will increasingly be a more important and will be directed more at this sort of a kind of market. Because venture started with big, hard problems, largely hardware driven, that, when you were, whether it was government or universities kind of working together, and then they were providing the kind of fuel to kind of commercialize. I think it's going to go back to that. I actually think that is a great place for venture capital when you are building kind of hard problems where 4 or 5 of your prototypes might explode before you get it right, maybe more, who knows. That's where it is. You can't underwrite exploded, prototypes. And so sure, you definitely get your contract, get your non-dilutive equity. But I think to the extent I'm going to be the defender of venture capital's role in the capital stack, I actually think when you're building hard things that take a while, aren't something that will be replaced 6 months later with a new feature set for the software, that's where venture capital does have a good role.
And when you think about the way people here can start to think through the decision tree, so to speak, what are some of the key questions that you would want someone asking who's in that headspace of what are the right things for me at this moment? Jared, you made that point. It's really about me at this moment. What does the business really need? How do we think about that? How do we get to a load-bearing answer?
I think a couple things are, one, have you already taken equity dollars? Who are the VCs that you're partnered with, right? And would it make sense to go do another round, right? To go get more VC dollars, and who are the partners that you're bringing on, right? It shouldn't be a matter of who's going to give me money, just at the baseline, who's going to give me money. It's who is going to provide meaningful capital and be a real partner for us to actually provide value in addition just to the dollars. I think it really depends on, again, if you're working in the government or in the government sector, right? It's what are the contracts that I have look like? What is the contract pipeline, and what is the timeline for those? If the government's shut down, right? Like when SBIR reauthorized, what is the pipeline and what is the timeline for those follow-on contracts? Maybe you have options that you're waiting to have exercised on any of those contracts. it's super, super nuanced to each team. And you really just have to look at your holistic situation as to what are the most meaningful dollars for us to be able to grow and scale and execute on what we need to.
Yeah, I'll add, when you say kind of the whole situation, I'd say a particular part of the situation, which is your end game, right? Any of these forms of capital are a means to an end. It's not money you get to put in your pocket. I mean, maybe it's to pay yourself a salary and keep getting to do the business, but there'd be other ways to earn a salary, right? This would be a hard way just to do that. So it's a means to an end.
This is a really dumb way to pay yourself a salary.
Yeah,
you're trying to
absolutely.
That's what you're trying to do. It's like, go get a job.
Yeah, that's all you're doing. So that's not what you're in it for. You're in it for an end. And what is that end? Really think about that, which I think, and work backwards from there, right? Venture capital, you mentioned the timeline. What that means, first, sometimes there's a timeline to get it, but it's really, you're going to have to operate that business a certain way to make venture capital make sense. You're going to have to grow very quickly. You're going to have to hold it for an exit and build something to sell. Again, to use the software analogy, I think there's going to be great opportunity in the next 5 years to build companies in the software space that just make a profit. I think it's going to be easier to build companies. I think it's going to be easier to run them with a lot less kind of cost. And yeah, while I think it'll be harder to build a moat around them, you don't necessarily need a moat if you can run a company profitably for 5 or 6 years, make a lot of money, and then move on to the next thing. But that's not a venture capital company. Similarly, what is your competition going to do, right? If your competition is going to raise a whole bunch of money and just get ahead of you in something where it might be a winner take all, or a few will win, you might have to raise that capital because the speed that you need to develop your end is a shorter fuse. But you pick the capital based on somewhat where you are, but it's really where do you want to go and what capital will get you there and allow you to get there and stay there. Mixing metaphors here, but you don't want to raise a sort of capital that's going to require you to build a business that's bigger, hold it longer, hold it for wherever it is than what you want to do. You want to make sure there's alignment in the end game with the capital.
I think, sorry, just real quick, what Steve said of knowing not just the general timeline, but the timeline of when do I need these dollars is super important, and knowing what the timeline is for each of those sources of capital. How long is it going to take if I go the VC route, if I go to a bank, right? How long is each of those going to take to actually get these dollars?
I would just add one more point. That is, if you're an early stage company, I think you would want to go and pick the right VC. That is going to help you open doors for customers, partners, collaborators. Hopefully the VC is not just writing you the check. Hopefully they're actually giving you something meaningful in terms of resources, network, advice, because they were former founders themselves. And that's not to say that banks couldn't do some of that too, but good VCs go beyond just writing the check. They will be able to lend you with the marketing power and the brand that they have as a large VC within the network, ability to open doors that you might not be able to yourself. And so I think that is a critical part, especially if you're an early company, that you're really trying to get your VCs to be on your side and be advisors for you.
I'll add just one more thing. We're making it seem like this is a situation where you sit down and say, all these people want to give me money. Who should I pick from, right? If only it were so easy. Sometimes it's also what's available to you, right? What are your options? What is going to find your company attractive? And there's correlation between that and what you think is the right fit for you. But sometimes, I have a colleague who says that the time to harvest money is when it's turned green, right? When the money's available, if that's the way that's available to you, and you need the capital, it should be a means to an end still. But sometimes you pick it based on it's an option.
Yeah. I want to open it up now to other questions from the audience. I want to make sure we get some time to dig in. Sir.
You look at the infrastructure models for space in terms of satellites are out there. Another company take possession of it. A lot of these are bespoke systems that, because of proliferated LEO, they become much could actually least the preprocessor, you could reprocess the satellite, so it's any activity in the market that
Spaceman.
Yeah, so for us, right, the debt financing with the contracts, it first of all, it's working capital or really any capital you need to continue to grow and scale. But it really depends because space is so nuanced. So we do work with a couple of space companies, but each time a new one comes along, it really is its own total entity in whole that we don't have a set playbook. Each time a specifically space company comes along, because like you were mentioning, there are so many different aspects to consider when looking at any type of investment in a space company. So it is really just incredibly nuanced.
Someone's going to do it though. Like right now, you're underwriting contracts. Some lenders are underwriting the VCs are going to put more money in after they'll put good money in after the bad. I don't think in space right now people are really underwriting the equipment, the asset that's up in the air, but why not? I mean, it feels like it's a valuable, to your point, as they become more
A
commoditized.
distressed asset that's really hard to get to.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
do you even need to get to it? I guess that's a question of an engineering, like,
Or just dispose it.
yeah, to what degree does it need to be, reached as opposed to repurposed in another way?
You want to start that company? It sounds like these guys might fund it.
Yeah.
Interesting. No, not at all. Get you next, sir.
we were talking about dual use government. I'm sticking with Stranis. We're working with them at one point. They've got a lot of commercial capability on COVID, but they want government to use it. They don't want to see that path. It seems like a harder path.
It's definitely a harder path because government
tried a lot.
government requirements are typically more stringent than commercial requirements, right? And the government requirements owners, I think I've seen Space Force backing off of requirements to try to attract more commercial players to come in, to say that, hey, if you have a commercial ready to go TRL-9 system, we're willing to write a contract to you to get 90% of the requirements and not 100%. I think I've seen at least Space Force in particular willing to take that step to try to be a better customer by backing off. I can't think of an example at the moment where a company actually started commercial first and then getting into government. Maybe there are examples of that in the software world, but I can't think of one at the moment.
I will say, if there was a time that was going to start to happen with any regularity or at scale, like now is the time with the reorganization into the portfolio acquisition executive structure, where they have a lot more flexibility and it's much less procedural, and it's not yoked to the requirements process the way it used to be. So there's more discretion on the part of individual government decision makers about what's worth the trade-offs of, this isn't vacuum sealed onto the requirement perfectly, but it's 90% there and I can have it for 50% of the price and I can have it tomorrow. That's versus 100% thing in 5 years. That's a government bespoke thing. They are explicitly being empowered and told, you need to go get the 50% thing tomorrow, right? That's very much
and that's a perspective kind of from the kind of acquisition side. I think the other challenge is from the company side, right? So it's not to say it's easy to go from kind of a federal contractor to a commercial business, but if you think like, all right, we have a business enterprise that right now is really good at compliance and working under constraints, and we're going to loosen the constraints, that's not without any kind of difficulty. But going the other way, all right, we're a free-flowing, quick-moving commercial company, but we're going to add a bunch of constraints to it. That is going to be, I think, a harder adjustment to make. Now, hopefully, you don't have to your point, don't have to go all the way to adjusting it if the government meets you halfway and kind of, but you're still going to have to culturally change. And I think companies of all sizes, startups through the biggest companies in the world, have struggled with kind of adjusting their culture to sell to the government, and some just decide it's not worth it. Though again, this is a market where the government customer is big enough and prominent enough relative to the industry that people are going to figure out how to do it.
My favorite example of this is Buzz Aldrin had to submit like a trip report after he went to the moon. You can just Google it. It's like that you can find the Google image of it. And you're like, if you're not willing to fill out trip reports for things, then like don't try to go from commercial into the government. If an astronaut like has to
Do
go
you get
do it.
reimbursed for mileage?
No, he
Like that?
tried to though. It's a famous story actually. He
Okay.
got reimbursed per day. He got a per diem instead of per
Instead of
mileage. Yeah, I know.
mileage,
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Anyway, just like that's what when you think about that, you're like, this is such a cool. The Apollo mission is incredible. Like this, and then you're like, oh, he had to fill out what? Like, are you serious? And that's what it means to work with the government, like, or to be an employee of the government, sir.
I have a question related. I mean, it's two-part question, but first is on the capital side. You mentioned that you finance, the contracts, which have different milestones and delivery. Do you have a constraint around how long milestones are set apart? Some of these projects could be 2 years, 6 months, they're different milestones. And how do you de-risk yourself from performance and delivery? Because at the end of the day, the government doesn't pay you if you don't actually deliver stuff. So just those two parts, and I have a follow-up depending on.
Yeah, so the way that we structure a debt facility is such that it is exactly tailored to the length of the contract, right? So it's pay when paid. We are only paid, the facility is only serviced when the contract payments come in from the government. So it's not a monthly payment hanging over your head. We try and take all of that worry away from the company so they can really focus on their core business. So whether, like you said, whether the contract is 8 months, whether it's 18 months, whether it's 24 months, right? We will tailor a facility that is directly aligned to the period of performance for that contract. And then as follow-on contracts come in, we're more than happy to, send them over to us. We take a look and we can add on to the facility as those follow-ons are won, right? To really create something that can grow and scale with companies as they do. In terms of the de-risking, right, and having to actually perform on the contracts and execute, that's where our capital comes in, so that the companies actually have the means to put the infrastructure in place to meet all of these milestones and execute and be able to be paid. That is, we're ultimately, our underwriting process is just really modeling out if we believe that our capital infusion is going to provide the company enough runway to be able to actually execute and finish out on the contract.
Yeah. So you don't typically do performance bonds or anything like that on top of it. So you have to secure yourself. And so I know that the space industry is, of course, vastly different. Things can blow up, for example. How do you actually, as a business, have you actually done a lot of the space related stuff, or this is more, your general approach in the space industry, doing something different?
Yeah, we do have a handful of portfolio companies that are in the space industry. And again, the underwriting is a little bit more nuanced. It's saying, if one of these whatever it is, satellites or whatever they're sending up to space, like you said, blows up, like what's going to happen, right? So and again, incredibly nuanced to each contract they're operating on, what they're actually producing, the period of performance, what the terms are, if anything were to go wrong, right? It's really taking a look at specifically what they're doing, what they're providing, and what the government is looking for, and what the terms of that agreement are.
Just one point, you guys now, there is a lot of private capital out there. It's just that it doesn't flow into the space industry because it's very, very risky, and people don't actually understand how it works. Because the space industry has its genesis in government-backed contracts, things haven't really moved in a direction where it's been structured enough for private capital to come in. How do you see the future of that trend? Because, more and more private capital is coming in, space is getting privatized. But a lot of the space companies that get backed by VCs don't get the kind of VC return in a space startup unless it's maybe CubeSats and smaller applications. How do you see this industry evolving from government backed to privatized?
So I think it's a lot of emphasis on what you said about VC type returns. And so that's a question of what sort of returns can they get in other industries? And I think a lot of what's going to prime venture investment in industries like space, including space, will be a lack of returns in some of their traditional hotbeds, right? The pure kind of commercial software, enterprise software. And so, there's a lot of private capital out there. It's going to have to find the best places to go. And I think as, you call it AI and whatever it is, kind of compresses the returns they can get on software, they'll be looking for other places where there might be big returns, and maybe not as big as they were getting. And again, it didn't start this way. It used to be that, venture was investing in the kind of risk mitigation phase, the can we build this thing phase. And then frankly, the public markets took it when it was, can we exploit it and commercialize it? I think we might see more of that. And you might start seeing space companies or hardware companies that are raising, a few $1,000,000 at a $6 million valuation, which right now space, it's a lot of big bets on really big plays. But if venture is solving that early stage, that kind of technology creation phase, and then another set of capital taking over, maybe you do start seeing more early stage, lower valuations where they can get venture-ish returns. They're not going to be able to put the $1 billion funds to work, though.
Just want to point out just one thing real quick on this point, because it's super important. Many of you have heard about the JP Morgan Chase commitment to do $1.5 trillion of capital right over the next decade. Less than 100 billion of that is equity financing, and of that, maybe 10 billion is going to be venture, and of that, most of that is going to be growth. So 1.5 trillion, maybe 5 billion goes into, probably less goes into early stage companies. So it's not actually, when you think about what venture capital is doing as it sits in the ecosystem, it's like a mosquito on the, on the body that is private equity and then public markets. It's just not that big.
That's why they let the PE lobbyists handle all the carried interest stuff. They're small.
That's right. Exactly.
2 weeks ago when I was having conversations, they actually look at the space industry as very small.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting, right? Like, it can be pretty big. So it's amazing that they commit to such a big chunk, but only this much is venture.
Yeah.
Can't get the kind of returns.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Great questions. Others? Yes, sir.
Big fan.
Mentor
MPP?
questions about mentor protege programs and also consortium models. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, for those who are not familiar with MPP or mentor protege programs, most defense primes have, I don't know how it's actually set up, but I think it's actually a DOD or DOW program. Is it SBA? Okay, SBA program where like those larger companies are allowed to bring on a set number of smaller companies to be under their wing and learn about things related to business development, maybe go to market together, bid on contracts together. I have not worked on an MPP program before, but I know that when I was with my previous employer, we heavily leverage MPPs because we know, just like most large companies, we just move too slow, right? We don't have access to emerging technologies, niche technologies. It's not going to get incubated in-house. And that's not to say that we just treat these, proteges as like potential or, the end goal is not like just to go and buy them, but really just to get access to options out there when it comes to smaller companies working on things that's not part of the main company, the larger companies like R&D and whatnot is actually really critical in order to continue to stay competitive. I don't know if so I'm saying yes to.
Yeah, the thing I would say is like Booz Allen is a great example of a services company that needs products to drive up their P-win for future contracts, right? So if you have a differentiated capability they can use to win a contract, they're going to love you, right? Because they know they suck at building products. This is like loosely quoting Brian McCarthy, who runs their CVC, right? They tried to build products, they couldn't do it. So they're going to help partner with products, right? And they're going to go deliver the product. They wrap the service around the product and go deliver it, right? But they're much more likely to be a differentiated solution the government will buy if they have game-changing products that are on their team. So the logic there works really well. I would say about mentor protege, just like any other big partnership you might be considering, is like, what's the logic for the company If the company is a product company, if you're dealing with like Lockheed on something specific and you're like, oh, I build a better whatever, it's like, does that actually help them? Does that help them with their existing programs? They make most of their money sustaining existing programs, not launching new programs. So it's making sure you're talking to the right people and they can explain to you what the business case is for them to work with you. I totally get the booze one. It's in their best interest to do it, and that's why they're so good at it. But for a lot of the other ones, I think the logic kind of breaks down because you're almost kind of like a competitor, right? In some
Unless you
weird
can
ways.
embed like the smaller companies' products or solutions into a larger
You
platform.
can get the government to ask for the thing you have, and then everybody will want to be everybody's going to want you as a directed sub for sure. I know we're. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a big signal. Yeah, definitely. Well, I know Isaiah is going to pull me off the stage with the Shepherd staff here in a minute. So just want to please join me in thanking the panelists for doing this, and thank you all so much for coming.
So like I was saying, the topic of this conversation is what we are seeing over the next 3 to 5 years, how pLEO is going to develop and what the kind of future holds. While Noah gets his mic set up right here, or if you're all ready to go, we'll start with you and then kind of work down the line.
This is on.
Perfect. If you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what you're working on just briefly, and then we'll kind of jump into the conversation about what the future holds.
Sure. Noah Feingold. I'm a principal over at Stellar Ventures. We are a specialized early stage space venture capital firm. If it enables space or is enabled by space, it's something we'll take a look at. Our first fund had a portfolio of about 23 companies. We're operating of our second fund now. We've got about 3 in there. We're also involved in an accelerator called Orbital Edge that I run on our behalf. It's a joint partnership program with 2 other investors and the International Space Station. The fun part about it is participants actually get a paid flight opportunity for being part of the accelerator. And then we also have an opportunity fund where we'll do later stage deals. Most recently, we invested in Vast in their first round. I think was announced last week. But yeah, specialist early stage VC. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sergio Gallucci. I'm the founder of Pivot Space, and through Pivot, we're building something that you could call a unifying layer for satellite and mission integration. A generalized interface for normalized operations. And prior to this work in trying to, and this is something I'm going to hammer on a lot probably during this panel, is coordination and integration of different satellite architectures, especially heterogeneous fleets. Before this work, I was the co-founder and CTO of Scout Space. And so my background comes from a perspective of space operations and control, mobility, and space domain awareness. And so hopefully I'll have some, fun, spicy takes on proliferated constellations.
Hello, everybody. I am Miklos Tomka, CEO and co-founder of Parsimony. At Parsimony, we are developing the first hardware-agnostic operating system for space. The idea is that people should be able to develop software once, and it should run on any satellite. And we are building the platform for that, which goes hand in hand with our first hardware-agnostic app store. So think Android Play Store for space.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bianca. I'm the CEO and founder at SpaceDots. SpaceDots is building the environmental intelligence layer for the new space economy. What does it mean? It means that we identify, detect, and attribute the hidden threats from space. That is everything that is not visible, meaning most in the space domain awareness are looking at tracking objects and space traffic control. We look at everything that has to do with space weather, radiation, all the dynamic environments of different orbits, and identify also how certain threats from the environment can be hostile intent. In fact, most of them get to mimic space weather, and in fact, it was something completely different. So we do work with civil and defense commercial operators, and this is all coming from my 16 years of being a thermal engineer in the space industry, where radiation was my number one enemy while designing and simulating and cross-correlating performance from space, until I realized that radiation and the environment wasn't just my enemy, but it was the whole space industry enemy. And so, yeah, I also have some spicy takes on this huge constellations that are coming up, and I hope it will be interesting.
Well, thank you all. We've got a lot of space experience on the panel here talking about the different ways that this entire industry has transformed over the last couple of years. Proliferated low Earth orbit is kind of the hot topic right now and is something that is rapidly changing. And so as you know, individuals that have spent so much time in the space industry, how have you seen the last couple of years accelerate so rapidly and change in the way that you have an outlook on what the future might hold? I know that you both have said that you've got some spicy takes, and how has that shifted over, you know, the recent years as you've gone on to start new companies that are operating here and looking at the different types of things that you see arise?
So I will start by saying that I'm extremely excited about what's happening. And this is because it gives a leeway for my business to exist. That's, I think that's what you
That's always exciting.
say. So that's, it's exciting to see how, again, you know, we use these words, contested and congested environments. It is really true. Another point about why it is exciting, but it's also scary, is to see just a few of the operators coming up with very big, bold claims, which sometimes is reducing trust within the industry of why do we have just a few operators filing for 1 million or tens of thousands of spacecraft in space, and now all the rest of us are going to deal with maneuvering and having to do all our operations in space. So again, it's you know, it's a double-edged sword. It's exciting for the markets to be from emerging to become actual infrastructure of the industry, but on the other side, it starts to crack the trust between nations and between operators.
Yeah, I think that's something that we've heard a lot over the last couple of weeks, that I've been talking to people about this, and then in the conversations that I've had recently, is that the huge problem is that there's just too much stuff up there, and there's a few main players that are launching so much all at once, and they're not talking to each other. And so you have all of these smaller people that are really trying to make leaps and bounds, and you're kind of at the mercy of what they're putting up there, what they're trying to accomplish, and the communication that they have between their satellites that don't necessarily care about yours. I know that Stargaze just got released, and SpaceX is really trying to create an environment where people know more about what's going on up there. And some of the conversations that I've had revolved around the fact that this is not democratic. They're not trying to do this to make it better for you. They're trying to let you know where they are so that you don't hit them and get out of their way in the first place. And so, Sergio, I know that you're working a lot on the communication layer and making sure that satellites can actually see each other up there. And so as these constellations grow, it becomes easier and easier for everybody to operate all at once. But how have you seen it develop, and where do you see it moving forward in the next couple of years?
So one thing I've particularly noticed is that it's never been technically a static environment, right? But you could generally assume that if you had mobility, you had to get out of the way of something. Generally, there is communication. It's a little bit ad hoc right now, how different operators can communicate with each other. But there is the possibility that you might do a maneuver to avoid somebody, and so will they. And a lot of times, you know, there's a non-negligible cadence between you sending that command and getting information back about what the actual outcome was. There are myriad problems with that. But, you know, even before we get to the point of resolving that, you know, that's a coordination problem. Before you can be coordinated, you have to be integrated somehow, some way, shape, or form. And generally, in the past, constellations of satellites were pretty similar. Okay, well, we have a bunch of these Intelsat, you know, vehicles. They're all generally the similar architecture. However, not all Starlink satellites are the same now, and so you cannot rely upon, you know, a generalized model for how a bunch of Starlink satellites might react and operate around you. And if you're trying to, for example, define a space traffic kind of coordination framework, well, you have so many different architectures, and you have such a heterogeneous, you know, population that you have to manage. that is an increasing, concern for keeping space safe and keeping it accessible is this continued broadening, I would say, of the boundaries of what a satellite is and can do.
Yeah, and a big part of that is interoperability between hardware. And I know, Miklos, that's something that you're working closely on. And as we kind of dance around the conversation about making sure that everybody can talk to each other and the difference between all the different satellites that are out there, how is what you're working on? Where did you start thinking about this, and how is what you're working on right now kind of shifting and transforming as you get these constellation networks that just continue to grow and expand?
Well, I think it's quite clear if you look at satellites in general that the satellite industry as a whole does not necessarily deliver the value it promised in a broad statement. So I'm very often talking to investors and they said, well, should I always invest more in Earth observation? I'm going to invest in a ton and the return, I'm not getting the returns. And I think one of the core issues is that satellites are very much like silos, whether it's 1,000 similar silos or it's a couple silos, and they don't talk to each other. They don't solve problems the same way, which leads to issues. I mean, it leads to issues to running software in orbit. I mean, it's not going to run on satellite A if you developed it for satellite B. It leads to issues of cybersecurity. They have different cybersecurity stacks. Sometimes they have none. It leads to issues of just using those resources efficiently in orbit. I mean, if it's difficult to deploy software, people are not going to deploy software, and therefore those assets will be sitting idle. So really what we are trying to do, we're trying to solve that problem by having a software stack that runs on any hardware. And obviously the question is, how do you have that adopted? I mean, why would people do that? I mean, it's one big argument we have is cybersecurity, but very few people are willing to pay for cybersecurity. So what we started to see is that if you can actually reach out to operators of satellites saying, hey, you are not generating the kind of returns you expect, we can help you to increase your revenues by deploying a new software stack that actually will make it very easy to deploy software in your orbit. And you can do it in a way which is cost neutral to them. They start to listen up. So obviously, I'm not talking here about Starlink or Kuiper or whatever. You need to start slow. But at the slow scale, I see very clear interest from smaller operators saying, hey, they are interested in deploying new revenue models where you can create bigger value with the satellite, which is secure, which is standardized, which is easy to use. And the moment that works on a smaller scale, it's much easier to go after the bigger guys saying, hey, you see that value those guys create, you could also benefit from it. So it's step by step, but I think standardization with a secure by design architecture is fundamental for everybody. Without that, it's not going to work. I mean, I have discussions with satellite operators who are, without hesitation, not even saying that there's a problem with it. They are telling us that they are sending down data with zero encryption. They are sending software in orbit and there is no isolation. It's like they are using things this is a ticking time bomb. And right now it's a one-off satellite, it disappears, okay, somebody lost a couple million. But the moment you have a constellation, some of those constellations are designed by the same kind of people. I was talking to somebody that's building data centers in orbit, and I said, well, my co-founder has built Docker cloud technology, Docker for desktop. Said, well, we can help you to make it more secure, more scalable so that you don't need to use what's on the ground. He said, no, what's wrong by deploying exactly the same software people run on the ground? We stopped the conversation right there. Running software on a satellite, it's not the same as running software on a data center on the ground. Still, some people think it is.
Yeah, I think you talked about you made two really interesting points, in that the satellites don't always say what they're supposed to do, and that there are a lot of new revenue models that are coming out here. Noah, how does that resonate with you? And as you see the market develop and founders like these come more and more and take bits and pieces of it, are you seeing similar things? And how do you look at the next couple of years of investments?
Yeah, so there's a couple things I want to parse here first before I can jump into that. The first is, I don't know if you probably saw last year, there was a study, someone with like a $300 wideband terminal was able to listen to 50% of traffic in geo, right? Like including a whole bunch of government and defense stuff too. So obviously an enormous problem where we're in a time where the technology is advancing fast enough that, yesterday's standards don't matter. And, that comes down to like a key in interoperability is defining standards, who's defining the standards, and more importantly, who's enforcing those standards, right? Like we touched on the mega constellation applications that are going into the ITU and into adjacent bodies. Do they have the teeth to turn those down? Like how are they turning them down? We're in this like kind of age of like carte blanche, launch as many as you want. We're not really going to tell you what's going to do. And there's a deeper question there about, what's the role in government in establishing standards and geopolitical and all that. I think that as far as interoperability, there's this kind of fundamental misalignment that's really prevalent in this industry, which is vendor lock, right? If you can afford to build your own standard and you can get your customer to commit to it, you can basically lock up that customer for an extremely long period of time. Now, it implies having a lot of capital and the ability to verticalize, and this is a model that SpaceX has, has been done by primes for very, very many years, but SpaceX has done an extremely good job, even going so far as to force the US government to buy in the form factor that they want, buy the service in their form factor. And so, there's a fundamental misalignment here where at the far end, goal, the mega constellations, they are not interested in working with other people. They're not interested in working on collaborative standards. So that's one of the things we're looking at is like, okay, those are edge cases, but those are also as a VC, like those are the big money edge cases. So when we look at, what the things you guys are looking at, it's like, is there a big enough market here? And who's going to be stepping in and making people play nice with each other so that the industry can grow in a healthy way instead of being, pigeonholed into standards being developed in the name of market dominance?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too. And the common case study that gets referenced is telecom, right? Where everybody kind of converged all at once and said, all right, our cell towers are just going to be used ambiguously here. Do you think that there needs to be a traffic cop? Do you think the industry will regulate itself? Or do you think that there actually needs to be somebody that steps in and says, here's how you guys play nice with each other?
That's a complicated question. Because of the international nature of shared space, you get into a lot of like, for lack of a better word, like it's geopolitical tension that's defining that, right? Like China put in $1 million, I think it was 1 million satellite constellation yesterday. Something like that, some like outrageous large number, and we've got American providers here putting out outrageously large numbers too, backed by our administration. So does it need to be regulated? Yes. Will a capitalist market regulate itself in this space? Probably not. Like if we want a good, fair market to exist where you're going to have the ability for small operators to come in and disrupt and interface with the system, it's going to need to be regulated by somebody. I'm not a person who's in politics, so I have no idea how that's going to happen here. But it's a
Bianca, I see you shaking your head with every word that he says. How do you
sorry,
feel
I
about
didn't
this?
mention EU at all. I know East is a big player here too, but
I agree. It is a very difficult question. When you asked the question, I thought it's the Wild West. That's pretty much where we are. And I was also thinking at the long-term effects of not having, unified regulations because of the geopolitical effects of what is happening. And because again, I always say space equals power in the same way that, the battlefield has been done on sea, land and air. This is now moving into space. So why would you want to regulate something where you can have space dominance towards some, an enemy or a hostile actor? So there is that too. But I think that the really difficult and long-standing effect that this is going to have is the fact that how can we think of having this utopian way of living in space and having settlements on the moon or Mars or whatever, if again there is a fight between us on who's going to do that in space? So that's already the first big question. And also, who is regulating for what? What are we really regulating for? Are we regulating in the same way in which we regulate China or Russia? How do we make those people talk to each other? It's very complicated. I had this question. I was at a NATO event, and I actually asked something where regulation really doesn't exist. So, for example, one of my questions was, where does my private liability ends or responsibility ends if I'm able to detect something that is happening to a national security asset, or maybe an asset that is commanded by the UK Space Command or the US Space Command, and I'm able to attribute a difference between, by the way, you're being jammed or something is happening to you. Where do I stop? Because some people think you could out lasers and you can act after the detection. And I'm like, but I'm not going to dazzle somebody because that's action after detection and identification. And that would mean escalating a war in space, and I will go to jail. and NATO, nobody had an answer. I was like, where is the boundary between us privates being able to identify something that isn't working, and then the government, who pushes the button? And because my assets are moving from the UK, but they are flying on SpaceX, who owns the asset? Is it the UK? Is it the US? Is it the Italian government? Because I'm Italian, nobody had an answer.
I've got, the elephant in the room, and I'm glad you brought that up, is the contested nature of space. And, one fundamental issue is that as we get into most of the markets being dual use at this point, and the space industry being just a data-based enterprise, where this is the only thing we import from space pretty much is data. Well, pretty much any satellite has, they're kind of under the potential liability of being a government, mission supporting asset, but they don't actually, they're not under the umbrella of protection, really. They're just kind of there, and they can be collateral damage to any sort of thing happening. And that's actually, one of the driving factors for the stuff that I've been working on, which has been, trying to find a way to normalize the space operations, because if you normalize a way to communicate to satellites, that opens the doors to centralized control potentially in case of crises, and that leads to potential coordination. How much more chaotic would the premise of and I'm going to get really heavy here, like mutually assured destruction would be if there wasn't the red phone at the White House that was able to deconflict between the two major players that were able to coordinate the operations of nuclear weapons between the holders of them. Well, we actually just have a bunch of flying bricks that can just disintegrate pretty much anything in orbit that are controlled by hundreds of different entities, and there's not really any way to deconflict them in a coordinated manner.
Yeah, I think we're talking really big picture here right now, and it's as you get to national security types of things. But where does this really start? What are the stepping stones that kind of lead into this larger conversation as we move and the constellation system develops? Sergio?
So at the starting point is the structural issue of spacecraft development, which is that every satellite still is relatively bespoke, or you could say even every generation of satellite is. Like I mentioned earlier, like all Starlink satellites are not the same. There's different, generations of them that are all slightly different, and there is this chronic NRE problem. There's always non-renewable engineering time being just put into integrating this new control system, or looking at this new ConOps and seeing how this architecture can accommodate that. From the scaling problem, we have this human mediated process that doesn't actually scale to the kind of proliferation we're seeing and is being projected or even stated to be happening in the future. I think that if not standardization, I think that standardization is a very hard thing to dictate, obviously, then some sort of means of mediating communication or mediating system integration, or maintaining a data set of how different systems work and what their constraints and boundaries are. Those are things that are really fundamental right now.
Yeah, Miklos, it seems like it really resonates with you, and I know that's kind of directly what you're working on.
Yeah, I think really for us, it has to start with communication before you say standardization. So we happen to work both with the European Space Agency and with NASA JPL, and I'm very often updating both about what's happening on the other continent, and they are super interested in learning. ESA is interested in learning about what we are discussing with NASA and vice versa. Because surprisingly, they don't talk. I mean, they talk at some level, but not at every level. So I think something that could be like a sort of good practice is this comes also to like constellations. I mean, if people just share some of the fundamental operating principles of this is how I operate, this is what I consider priority versus lower priority, this is how I make certain decisions, then people can argue, and there could be some kind of consensus that that's the optimal path for all of us, and then we can align. I mean, political force it's hard. I mean, there's no global political power. So people will always say, well, in Europe, we are doing it this way, and in the US, we're doing it this way, and we agree to disagree. Well, but if we agree on that these are the key driving factors for certain decisions, then we can at least focus on that. So I think communication for me is a key starting point where both on the different government levels, but also talking about mega constellations. I mean, I know nothing about Starlink architecture. I'm asking questions, and it's pretty secretive. So I mean, if they were to share, I'm not talking about the code or a very detailed information, but these are some of the principles. One can say, well, why are they doing it this way? Maybe they are doing it really, really well. Then I should replicate. Or if it's not so well, I should feed it back to them because maybe they're not perfect either, and they could be better. So just exchanging some of those things is actually quite helpful. And I think we need to start with that. I mean, we need to say, hey, why are there shortfalls? What are the risks? Just bringing those to the table and saying, hey, this is how I think about addressing it. I mean, I had a long discussion with my CTO. Much of our software is proprietary to us, and he says, well, I just want to share it with the world so the people can see how we are thinking about it. It's not going to take business. I mean, that the discussion was, are we going to lose business? He says, no, we won't. But if people understand how we work, it's way easier to align interests, and it's way easier to say, hey, Northrop Grumman, Rocket Lab, who knows, NASA, look at this is our architecture. Let's talk about it. Let's see if we can align. Let's see what you think about it. Let's build something where the interests are aligned. I don't think there will be any commercial. I was convinced that there will be no commercial impact, and now I agree with that. I think exchanging will lead to a better space ecosystem, and that starts with communication.
Do you think that will actually happen? And what's the kind of reality of the situation? I mean, it would be amazing if everybody can get on the same team and continue to share as much information as possible so that the industry grows together. But what's the more realistic take about how this might play out?
Maybe I'm just naive, but we're working on it. So basically, I mean, I'm making connections between ESA and NASA. I mean, it's like we are learning about F prime with JPL, and I will share that with my colleagues at the people I'm talking to at ESA and vice versa. We are going to share technology details. We just developed, we are going to release a CCSDS STLS software stack for satellite security, which apparently even NASA doesn't have. And we'll just make it open source. So that's another thing where you can just say, hey, share certain things of your work for the greater good of the whole satellite ecosystem. Maybe somebody else is willing to say, well, they have shared something, I can also share something. So I think one has to be optimistic that humanity has some good things to come. Because if we all say, well, I just close the door and bye-bye, then the world is over. I don't think we are there. So we all have to, I mean, that's my personal perspective. I mean, maybe I'm just naive, but I think we need to do the right thing, and if we talk to the right people, sometimes it comes back.
Yeah, outside of sharing and making sure that everybody has equal and adequate information so that you can move forward, where are the largest gaps that you kind of see and what you're working on that is preventing the technological advancement outside of the social, business, and capitalist barriers that you have going on right now? Sergio?
There is a huge gap between operators and innovators, I would say. And this is something that we see within government acquisitions, both in the European side of things, in the American government side of things, where the ones that are the acquirers of capability are not the same ones that actually operate it or need it. And we see this also in the business case, in the business world, where operators that need to fulfill a mission, they're not going to buy this amazing, new software stack. They're not going to integrate this into their mission. They're not going to buy this new thruster that enables a unique capability that's a differentiator for them. They're going to buy a bus that may or may not have that integrated. And there is no incentive from the bus providers to necessarily incorporate innovation proactively into their business models. They're going to sell their bus. It's a commodity in a lot of ways. And that, operator to, innovator or specific subsystem technology gap is a really big thing. And that's, as I was advising a couple of companies in the mobility space and in the deep tech space over the past couple of years, that was something that I really kind of cottoned onto and helped inspire me to focus on what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, no, when you hear things like the innovators aren't talking to the operators, and that's one of the major gaps that's kind of preventing technological advancement. Does that affect your investment thesis in any way? And how does that play into the way that you're evaluating companies and the industry as a whole for whether it's a good investment?
It's an interesting question. I mean, all startups fundamentally, like at some point, start with just a single person spreading their idea and their technology out across enough other people, and then eventually reach a critical mass where people are convinced that you're doing something important, and they start paying you for it, and then now you scale and you build a business out of that, right? The first step in that is talking to an operator, and many operators most likely, and finding the first couple that have a really strong pain point around what you're doing, and going out on a limb for you, and bringing on and testing your capability and paying for it, right? I think you're not wrong. Like, there are a lot of founders who are really focused on the technology and the idea, and the idea that they have in the world of what it should look like with their technology, and so they push forward towards this idea that may or may not be grounded in reality. But I do think like really good founders, and all three of you guys up here are talking to operators, and you're figuring out what the problem is, and you're tailoring your technology a little bit to make sure it's fitting exactly what the operators want, so that you can scale with them and solve their key pain points.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty proactive way to look at the market and the industry. And as we talk through some of the big issues that are out there, it doesn't seem like a lot of them are the technical problems. There are technical problems, obviously, right? Hardware and software and everything in between needs to get better. But it seems like the biggest challenges that the industry and all you are facing right now are more of the capitalists and the structural barriers that go into regulation and making sure everybody plays nice with each other.
Yeah, a little bit, and I'll let you know in a second. I want to go back to you're talking about bus manufacturers as a commodity, right? And to some extent, you're right. And the difference between the bus manufacturers is really how well capitalized they are and how they're able to take risk based on that capital, right? Like, if you're Apex and you just raised $500 million, a good chunk of that $500 million allows you to fly nascent technology that you can add to your catalog and service a new set of customers. So even though your core capability is a commodity, you are actually incentivized to work with startups to bring in new capabilities in your catalog, because you're trying to skate ahead of the puck, in the same way we are as investors in some ways, in the way your startup founders are. And so you're looking at your customer like, you're probably going to need, like, let's take optical. Optical is the easiest one, right? People have been talking about forever. There's not a mature offering on the market. You're a bus provider. You're like, I need to help mature an optical technology as fast as possible, because I know that the big customers in the government are going to buy a capability with optical, not without it. And so they can take risks, and they can help push startups into being more mature and into a good place with their technology. But that like all comes back to your ability to be financially sound enough to take risks. And I think that's kind of the role that venture capital plays in the ecosystem right now. And you see a lot of mega rounds out there right now. It's like, well, do they really need that much money? It's like, is it efficient business? Well, they need to help mature some of the enabling pieces of the industry so they can expand their business also.
Yeah, Sergio, did you have something to add?
Yeah. I think that there's, I agree with that role. I think in venture capital as being, enabling companies to take risks and serve as, I would say, better mediators, between operational needs and technological capabilities, even if it's for their own benefit, right? Of having a differentiated, quote unquote commodity. But I would say that actually there is definitely a technical challenge to it. It's not like we have a universal, interoperable, just applicable and unilaterally control capability, for example, that can integrate with both 1960s reaction wheels that might be flying out there, as well as like RCS systems that are like in the micronewton range. There is no such thing, and that is a technical challenge. That said, there's the capitalistic challenge of, well, there's technically no incentive to it, because you still get paid to make your new drivers, and you still get to pay your GNC team to write new ones for your new mobility system. That said, that is an inefficiency that can be mitigated.
Yeah, and I think it kind of full circle comes back to what Bianca started with about, if you see something that is relevant to national security, is it your responsibility to say something? And is it your responsibility to take action? And so when we talk about incentive structures, how do you see that kind of playing out when you have access to so much information? Is it your responsibility to share it? Is there something that should be mandated? I know it comes back to what we were talking about everybody should be sharing information and playing nice, but when it comes to reality, how does that work out in your head?
As I was listening to the conversation, the one thing that also popped up in my mind is that I would love for more space founders to actually be taught or mentored about politics and lobbying. And we are in one of the biggest cities for lobbyists. And this is because what I'm doing pretty much with the Italian MOD, with the Italian government, with the US, with the Department of Defense, with the UK MOD as well, or the government. And this is because, first of all, if they don't know that you have a capability that could be interesting to them, then they don't know. They don't know what they don't know. So how do I make sure that I'm in the right room speaking with the right people? But then at the same time about regulations, how do I make sure that the government, whatever is the government that I'm selling to operators to, really understand the importance of this. And this goes down also into capital. How many grants we've applied and we've never won because they had been written already behind closed doors for somebody else who had lobbied the government, or regulations, or again, rules that had been written already with somebody in mind. So I think that as much as space tech is difficult because of the huge capex and the huge, difficulty of actually having to go to space and work, and there is not much you can do once you've sent your hardware in space. Most founders would need to know how to get into the right rooms and convince the right people, like Elon Musk did, like many others did. That's the only way. And also be capable of doing this exercise in different nations and understanding what different nations really want. So it's more of a, for me, and I'm learning to do this, and I was an engineer once. Now I feel like I'm some sort of intelligence person who needs to learn what people want and what they want to hear. But I think this is extremely important because, again, space tech and the services that humanity receives from space are so geopolitically charged right now that not knowing the political environment in which you're playing with, it means that your business may die tomorrow just because you were not in the right room speaking with the right MP at the government.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Like, this is still an industry dominated by the US government as a key customer. The governments in general, but most of my experiences here. So the US government sets a lot of the standards. They also support a lot of the technology innovation. Right? Like, SBIR, SPTR is divisive right now, but I'm a huge fan of SBIRs. I don't think the early stage space industry, especially, and the work that, Space Force specifically has done, could exist without the SBIR system. And yeah, you get some noise in the phase ones, but, space, we're lucky space is full of very serious founders. I think you asked a question about whether technology is the hard part. I think in all the diligence we've done over the last 7 years, there's only been 2 companies that the physics was impossible. For the most part, founders understand that this is a really hard place to be and a hard place to build businesses. And the technology, they don't come to the table with technology that will never work. It may be expensive to test it and build it, and things may go wrong. But for the most part, we see very technical founders trying to grow businesses and kind of coming up that curve that you're mentioning here. It's like, now I got to find a lobbyist and go to offices in Congress. Maybe I have a colonel who's supporting me, but he's not going to carve the appropriation out himself. So I got to do that myself too. So, for really early startups, it's not that big a deal, but you very quickly come to realize you need to be planning 2-3 years ahead with this if you want a big piece of budget.
Yeah, I think that all really resonates. I hate to try to close out this conversation, but I want to open it up to Q&A and make sure that we have a time left for any questions. So if there's some questions from the audience.
Hi, I fully recognize the severity of this problem, overcrowding in the space. But just for the sake of parallel, we do have an industry here, which is the aviation industry. A whole bunch of planes flying all over the globe across geopolitical boundaries, and somehow we've managed to figure out how to make sure that they don't crash and burn. Is there any learnings that we can use for the aviation industry that actually create the stepping stones for the space industry?
And before we jump into it, any questions? I'm going to repeat just for everybody that's watching online. But the question is there takeaways that you can learn from the aerospace industry and making sure that planes don't hit each other while they're in the air on Earth?
So actually, I've worked a little bit with a collaborator that was an air traffic controller, and her and I and some of my other team members in the past were looking at, okay, what is a framework for space traffic control in a similar way? The problem with applying it that way is that we have fairly discretized ways that airplanes work and missions that they fulfill, and generally. We don't try to hide necessarily what a plane is. If you're flying, like an SR-71, it looks like an SR-71. And it's frowned upon to make a military plane look like a civilian plane. However, like I mentioned earlier. Microphone's dead. Space is a data delivery domain primarily, and so there is uncertainty about where exactly that data is going and whose it is and who's even the operator, because we're not necessarily going to be in direct link or having a pilot that is from somewhere in particular on it. And so that uncertainty, I think, is a contributor to challenges to it, as well as frankly, the industry being very reticent to actually apply, standards, right, or a mobility framework, kind of thing to itself.
We've had a lot of different. Not exactly the same complexity, but I believe strongly that most of free markets in general, the world and the industry would kind of figure themselves out. Do we really need, regulation? This is more of a slightly devil's advocate question, but are we overblowing this, or is this something that is it because we don't believe that parties will come together, or do we actually believe there's risk in not starting standard?
I think I think the problem here, and you touched upon, is that the private space industry is such at an embryonic stage, which is really difficult to understand how it's going to pan out. And also one of the key elements, one of the key differences that we see with ground industries like aviation or even automotive, because I would love at some point to see the space industry to be just any other industry like all the other ones, where we have all the different layers of the infrastructure, from insurance to anything that applies to all the other economies. We are not there yet, but there is also the lack of the humans in place. For example, as much as we've had for the past 20 plus years astronauts going to space, that's never been civilians. If we had civilians going up to each of these constellations, I think there will be regulations in place.
Got that right.
One other thing with regards to regulation, and perhaps the necessity of it, is localization of impact of events or activities. If you dump trash in your backyard, there's trash in your backyard. If you dump it into the ocean, it might migrate, into the Pacific, trash pile. But that's something that we weren't really tracking until fairly recently. However, in space, it's fairly transparent. What might be happening if, for example, your satellite fails, and what happens is that it's going to be flying over all sorts of different countries as a failed asset. And there's other aspects to the proliferation of satellites in LEO in particular that people aren't really tracking on. For example, star trackers, which a lot of satellites still use for attitude determination and figuring out where they are, where they're pointing, are hitting higher and higher false positive rates on where stars are, because there's more satellites getting in the way and occluding stars potentially. There's much more, many more broader impacts to satellite operations not done, with due diligence, I could say, than in a lot of industries on Earth. And that makes it really, really challenging, especially as we've all gotten used to it being the Wild West.
Yeah, I think the question is a good one. Will it regulate itself? And the answer is probably yes, but is it in a way that's for the greater good or aligned with whatever the world power is? I think that's the better question. I mean, look, if you even take your analogy of the internet, which I think is a bad one, because the consequences of having bad internet companies are not the same as having for example, like a Kessler event across Starlink's constellation that just wipes out that orbit and future access to space above it, right? The scale of consequences is a little bit different being engaged in the physical world. But the internet even now is consolidated into a handful of major players, and the U.S. government is constantly stepping in to try to regulate them. The European government is constantly trying to step in and regulate them. There's all sorts of fundamental impacts to everyday life that we're still kind of understanding the psychological nuance of, and the illegal things they've done, and antitrust and all that. So will it regulate itself? Has it regulated itself? Not particularly. I think, if we think about applying lessons from other industry, there is one in there, which is that it's better to be ahead of the curve, trying to set standards and trying to make things good from the get-go than trying to step in and convince Elon Musk to do what the rest of the world wants, because that's just not going to happen.
Just as a follow-up to what you just brought up, if you don't mind, don't you believe that fewer players are easier to regulate than? So isn't there an advantage in aggregation so that you can then regulate it?
No, but we can take this offline.
I think we could speak forever about
Yeah,
this topic, honestly.
This is a very theoretical
I think we
debate.
have time for one or two more questions. So if there's anybody else in the audience that has something that they'd like to ask.
Thanks for the great discussion. I'm curious to hear what you think the role of AI is in all of this, greater autonomy.
I will attempt, considering that we are also using AI. But what I would say is that the proliferation of AI in space is that for any AI to be useful, you need data. And in space data, it's really hard to get. And it's really hard to get out what you really want to see. So again, the whole point also of Space Thoughts is to be able to provide AI information like trigger warning directly from space without even had to do the downlink of the data and use a SaaS platform, which is just so outdated as a concept, I think, but I have to do that for the time being. But it's being able, it's really complicated. If you think about ChatGPT, it's been trained on a gazillion data from humanity. We don't have that capacity yet from space. And this is also because most of these data is for national security interest. So you wouldn't give that information to an AI for some autonomous moves that you have to do in space. I think we are a bit far from that. But I would love to say that we're moving towards, again, if we start sharing information while keeping obviously, certain secrets and certain competitive edge aside, I think we can get to that point where AI can actually fundamentally change how we automate operations in space.
And if I may add to that, I think really the question is, what is that AI doing? So if we just look at the capability and quantity of sensors we are deploying in orbit, we are looking at massive amounts of data. And today we don't have optical downlink yet. So it's just right now, physically, it's impossible to download all of that data, especially with the most recent sensors. And people are deploying more and more sensors. So I mean, one can say that I want to have a complete AI solution which comes with a complete insight, and I just have the solution sent back to the ground. Well, that may or may not be feasible today, for the reasons you just mentioned. But if we can say that with the help of AI, we can eliminate half of the data because that's just useless. So I think there are different uses of AI. And personally, I believe that, yes, AI is absolutely a necessity to process data in orbit simply because of the amount of data collected. But what that AI does, I mean, very sophisticated AI could be far away from being properly trained and deployed, but simple AI, which is focusing simply on, hey, what can I do with that massive amount of data because I can't download it? I think that is something that is imminently necessary.
There's been some work analyzing directly autonomy and navigation and control that might be achieved with an autonomous kind of AI-driven capability versus a purely analytical and sensor-based approach. And the findings of that research in general, and it's been a couple years since then, was that there literally wasn't enough data on maneuvers and the efficacy thereof in case of things like a potential collision, avoidance scenario, for it to be more effective or efficient in any way to be using machine learning for it. That said, autonomy doesn't just mean using machine learning for it or having an AI agent do it. I think that actually one of the most important ways that we can apply AI to space development is on the ground. And it's in automation. It's in cutting out some of our repetitive tasks in testing, qualification, and assessment of how systems behave and interact and interface. That's something that I think a lot of people kind of glaze over. They focus on, AI in space. Well, AI for space can be even more effective than that. And, generally, it's good to just keep things simple.
Yeah, there's two things I want to expand on there. The first is the last thing you mentioned, which is essentially simulation, right? It's like there's not enough data out there, but with current AI capabilities mod sim capabilities, you can run a very extremely large number of simulations that you would never have used to been able to do, either through accumulation of data or by hand, and really understand and train models to do autonomy. I mean, people don't steer satellites, like it's not like planes, for generally speaking. So there's some level of autonomy already in there, but clearly needs to be upgraded, and needs to be upgraded based on robust data sets. My mind immediately went to tools, and I think this makes interoperability even more important. AI exponentially lowers the barrier to entry to create new capabilities, right? And it's being fed into hardware development. It's being fed into coding new programs and software. And this is a good thing, generally speaking. It lets more people participate in the industry, but it's also going to create a lot more noise and a lot more less rigorous products being developed and launched, let's call them. And so it does, create a little bit more of a what is the minimum standard that people are being held to make sure that this is not going to be negative for the rest of the industry.
I will start by saying that as going through the whole journey of, understanding radiation, it didn't occur to me that radiation in space could be man-made because of a nuclear weapon. And I was completely oblivious to that because I didn't want to think about it. And then I went into the rabbit hole of this, and it's very likely possible to have that in space, and that obviously would proliferate as much as all the constellations that we know, not just to your target, but to everything else around. And what we do about it, not much right now, if something like that happens. That's a very, it's the worst case scenario. There are anti-satellite weapons that have been used to really test how your satellites would respond and how everything will happen in space. I don't think we are at the stage where we wouldn't know that something that's been sent to space, it's a weapon. But there are many other silent weapons that have been used, and they are non-kinetic attacks, the ones that I was saying before. Even if you're jamming or spoofing or chasing another spacecraft, that's a silent attack to another spacecraft, which is not just nuclear.
We have exploded nuclear weapons in space in the past, the Starfish project. I think it was in the 60s or 70s. And the outcomes of that were just significantly increased radiation across a couple of bands for like 2 to 4 years. The thing is that it would be very bad because, especially in low Earth orbit, low Earth orbit isn't really space, honestly. Like you don't have to really worry that much about some of the really big problems that you face in the space environment, like a lot of single event upsets. or I guess those are the only things you really have to worry about. You don't have to worry very much about radiation there. So a lot of satellites are actually not suited for surviving any sort of irradiated regime. And they're not EMP shielded at all. That's not a standard thing outside of government missions that are for national security. But the space domain is, I think, the next layer of deterrence, right? And I think that is a rabbit hole I think nobody yet has wanted to go down, which is a great thing.
I think the key word there is deterrence. There's a lot of concern, like the next war is going to be fought in space. It's going to be a Cold War, right? It's like an escalation of capability to make sure that whoever makes the first move is going to be adequately reciprocal, right? And then with any luck, that first move will never happen because the capability will be reciprocal on both sides, and we'll just continue to grow capability and adjacency to our allies, or sorry, our adversaries and our allies. But the primary concern is our adversaries. But as far as nuclear weapons or putting other weapons in space or the ability to destroy satellites, I mean, it exists now. It's been existing for a long time. The next generation of novel capabilities that customers are acquiring, is to augment and expand upon capabilities that already exist today. So is the concern, are we going to have our adversaries detonating nuclear weapons in space or taking out our assets? Yes, always. But it's not like it doesn't exist now or hasn't existed for 20 years. So 20 plus years.
All right, but meanwhile, we will go ahead and kick off. James, you ready? Perfect.
Testing. It is working.
All right, now we can go for it. So hi, everybody. My name is Beth Bacareza. I'm a program manager at BMNT. I will not exhaust the crowd here and online by saying again what BMNT does, but I will say that I'm very excited to have James Berger from Seraphim Space, Chief Investment Officer and co-founder, with us today for this fireside chat. So the day commenced with a contracts to capital panel. We then segued from that panel discussion to the future of proliferated LEO, what's here and what's coming next. And now we will capstone the day by having probably the most prolific space tech investor globally, representing their thoughts on, well, James will be representing his thoughts and Seraphim's thoughts on, what they're seeing from the constellation perspective and also what's coming next when we think of from constellation to coordinated networks. So Seraphim, actually, I will let James intro himself a bit more and Seraphim, and then we will kick off into some of the questions. So James, over to you.
Thanks, Beth, and hi to everyone in the room and those online. So just to introduce myself a little bit more in terms of my background, I'm a historian by training. Specializing in the history of madness, which has turned out to be exactly the right subject to focus on for then building a career in space. I launched my first startup whilst I was doing my undergrads during the .com era, so you can figure out roughly how old I am on that basis. Raised some money, did okay, won some awards, made literally every mistake that it's possible to make, and have spent the last 20 years making up for it by trying to help other entrepreneurs avoid making all the mistakes that I made. So I've been working as a venture capitalist now for 20 years. The first 10 years in deep tech, before deep tech was called deep tech, but in all sorts of areas around AI and material science, to name but two. Fast forward 10 years, and so about a decade ago, and I set out with my co-founder to launch a thematic focused venture fund. And we very quickly zeroed in on space as being the area that we wanted to focus on. So at that point, SpaceX was doing some pretty cool things, but it certainly wasn't returning rockets. It had no satellites in orbit, and there were a handful of other companies that were pretty early in the new space journey. So we dived straight in and launched the world's first venture fund in 2016, focused on space. And the 10 years since has been a pretty wild ride for the sector. And we've kind of been involved in that over that 10-year journey, to the point where today we now, although we're London headquartered, we operate globally. There are really three elements to our business. We still have venture funds that do early stage investing. We followed up doing the world's first venture fund by doing the world's first listed fund focused on space. Tip for everyone in the audience, don't try and go public with a team of like 4 people. Not something I want to do again. But we do now have a listed growth fund that does sort of later stage through to the point that businesses hopefully go public or get exited. And then the third element that really sits at the start of that value chain is our accelerator, where we're really starting to help and support companies and entrepreneurs, even from the point that they're still at university, developing their technology, coming up with their concepts. That program's now been running since 2018, 15 cohorts. About 100 companies have gone through that have collectively raised more than $1 billion and with a higher hit rate in terms of raising money than Y Combinator. We don't have yet the decacorns that the Y Combinator have, but there are some hopefully on the way. So across all of those activities, we operate truly globally. So we've now got portfolio companies in 33 different countries around the world. And our activities support companies right the way through that journey from coming up with the concept through to hopefully building a really big and sustainable and meaningful businesses. So that's about 150 companies over the last decade that we've supported, which makes us by some measure the most active investor. My role as founder and chief investment officer is really to lead all of our investment activity. And through that, I've been fortunate to be an early investor in companies like AST Space Mobile, and ISI, to name but 2. The particular area that we have focused on most in the last 10 years has been Proliferated LEO. So hopefully that gives me a reasonable basis for having a chat today, and happy to answer questions as well.
Thanks, James. Thanks, James. Wait, is this working? Is it blinking?
Green.
It's blinking. We'll switch for the time being. Thanks. Okay. All right. Thanks, James. So as a segue, so when you reflect on Seraphim's portfolio to date and the pLEO related companies that you've invested into, how does that shape how Seraphim sees this market now? So I suppose we'll do a quick kind of retrospective. What drew you to investing relatively early on in this space? And then what are you seeing now as the current opportunities that you're interested in, or at least considering?
Yeah, well, I mean, 10 years ago, the thesis was a really simple one. If you can drive down costs by several orders of magnitude through low-cost launch and reusability, but also miniaturization and borrowing commercial off-the-shelf technology to build smaller satellites. What does that enable? It enables large constellations. Why do large constellations matter? Because it gives you ubiquity. Ubiquity either in terms of connectivity that you're seeing now from the likes of Starlink, or ubiquity in terms of sensing that you're now seeing from the dozens of constellations that have launched satellites. So we saw that as just a massive unlock in terms of what those capabilities will mean, not just to the space sector, but to the world as a whole. And as I say, 10 years ago, there were a handful of companies that had launched a handful of satellites. Fast forward 10 years to today, and we've got individual constellations of 10,000 satellites or more, which is just crazy. And I think the basis of that thesis has largely been proved out. 10 years ago, there was a lot of skepticism within the space sector that this whole new space thing was actually going to be a viable business. I think it's pretty incontestable today, given that the world's most valuable company and expected to be the biggest IPO ever is one of these space businesses, that this model of putting up very low cost, large constellations of satellites is hugely disruptive to the space sector. There are many companies now that have launched their capabilities, but I think the key thing I'd say is we're still only getting started. We're still only in the foothills of this journey. The last 10 years has shown technically and commercially what is capable, but the 5 and 10 years ahead is really where you're going to see another order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude of change and proliferation.
Are you able to, can we pull on that thread a little bit? And as much as you feel comfortable kind of diving into what, kind of finger in the air, perhaps what you think will be coming down the line, what will be or what should be based on what you're saying as constellations continue to scale in the next 3 to 5-ish year timeframe?
Yeah, I don't know if we'll get there in 3 to 5 years, but at a certain point within the next decade, are we going to hit 100,000 satellites in orbit? I think we probably are. So we're talking, a 10x increase from where we are today. Amazing opportunities that will present, but also a lot of profound challenges of operating that scale of constellation, but also all of those constellations learning to play nice together, I think is going to be something that is yet to be solved.
So perhaps this next question is a bit redundant, but let's capstone on the point. Okay. So what do you see being some of the key bottlenecks? So you just mentioned one. Can you kind of riff off of other bottlenecks that you've seen from some of your portco companies that they may be experiencing?
Yeah, I think, look, there's for any would-be satellite constellation, I mean, there are still tons of bottlenecks. We'll start with the obvious one, capital. I'm working on it, but there is still a need for a lot more capital to come into the market. Record levels of investment year on year, fantastic. But in terms of being able to give businesses what they need to really scale out quickly, which I think in the case of anyone who's putting up a large constellation of LEO satellites, you have to be able to do. You typically have to have a certain degree of critical mass in your constellation before it has any meaningful utility. So that, I think, remains a challenge. Launch remains a significant challenge. The market today is a quasi-monopoly for SpaceX and their transport missions. They're not doing very many missions. I wish they'd do more. I have asked, and they're pretty infrequent. So it's still a bottleneck for getting stuff into orbit. And sure, once Starship is fully online and launching at a high cadence, and the capacity is available for people other than SpaceX and Starlink to avail of, that may well get solved. There are obviously other launchers that are endeavoring to come into the market, but it's a tough old business building and not just building rockets, but being able to launch them at high cadence and at price points where you can even vaguely compete with SpaceX. So that's not a solved problem today. And I think the other really big one that we see in every single business across the space ecosystem that's building stuff, supply chain is just a massive bottleneck. It is still a very fragmented supply chain for a lot of these companies, a lot of mom and pop suppliers that don't naturally lend themselves to scaling. This is why SpaceX has taken such an aggressive approach to vertical integration. It becomes such an impediment to be able to scale and execute and move quickly. So I think all three of those are areas just for being able to put stuff up. Now, the questions of then what comes next in terms of the bottlenecks and the constraints of all of these large constellations, or just being able to see what's there is an obvious one. So space situational awareness, I think, and space traffic management, the way in which all of these constellations are going to have to interact with each other. I think those are all areas that are going to become an increasing pain point as we start to see degrees of greater crowding in orbit.
So on that note, it's actually a perfect segue. So you described kind of the latter bit, so the connective tissue, autonomy, orchestration software, intersatellite operability. So do you see that as so you kind of mentioned that you see it as an emerging market. Do you think that is there a defined market out there? What's the hypothesis? What is the investment thesis, I suppose, when it comes to once you get the assets manufactured up in space and now they need to, kind of work together? What does that look like from your perspective as you're evaluating deals that Seraphim might be making?
So look, I think in terms of connected tissue, there's probably two ways of looking at it. There's enabling technologies for ensuring that all of these constellations can operate effectively at scale and in a coordinated way. Orchestration and coordination, not the same thing. So things that from sort of a mission management perspective are enabling deployments of constellations of tens, if Elon gets his way, millions of satellites in due course. I think that's a developing area. I'm not sure the industry as a whole is really thinking as much as it needs to about how much of an acute problem that can be. But I think actually the other end of the lens is where we're probably more interested, which is from an orchestration perspective, what does it mean for the end users? So if you're trying to buy Earth observation today, it's all pretty siloed, one constellation provider to the next. So being able to actually orchestrate tasking, that's something which is starting to happen, principally in government, but I think it will come into the commercial domain. Layering on top of that, data fusion and actually being able to exploit all of the different modalities and different constellations. And on the comm side, just a ton of opportunity for orchestrating the pretty disparate commercial and government networks from space.
Let's pause there, B. I know in previous panels there were a number of questions coming through. In case there are a number of questions coming through now, I want to pause and see if we can address any that have come through so far. Okay. No, perfect. Just wanted to make sure so the folks online feel like they are being seen and heard. Anything before we continue from the audience here, based on what we've discussed? Yeah, please.
I guess besides like AI data center application, what do you think would be like the biggest market? Like why would people want to go to pLEO? So maybe like Earth observation is the biggest one, maybe it's something outside.
Yeah, so the question is, where are the big opportunities in LEO outside of data centers? We can pull on the thread of whether data centers is a big opportunity.
Feel free to comment. I mean, I know it's a hot button issue, or at least for a lot of conversations.
I'll park that for the time being. Look, I think the thing to remember about Earth observation, and we're like very bullish on just how impactful space-based Earth observation can be. But it's a tiny market in the context of the overall space industry. So you're talking about an entire industry that's sort of mid-single-digit billions today, a large chunk of which is US DOW and other governments. So commercial applications are still pretty modest when it comes to Earth observation. We think that will change as you get the density and diversity of these networks, particularly when you then start overlaying artificial intelligence onto those massive data sets. And that is a key area that we've been investing in. But I think comms as a whole is disproportionately by far the biggest segment of the space market. And we think there's tons more of opportunity and application to come around the ever-increasing convergence between space-based connectivity and terrestrial connectivity. Be that 5G broadband for one of our portfolio companies like AST Space Mobile, it's taking on Starlink, right the way down to low data rate companies that are doing direct-to-device, leveraging geo satcoms, like portfolio company like Skylo, and a ton of other applications. So building on that, an area that we're particularly interested in is the sort of ecosystem that's being enabled by all of this connectivity that's coming to space, all of the applications here on Earth that are now starting to become possible because of the fact you have reliable and ubiquitous connectivity. So it's as much about the downstream from our perspective as it is about the upstream for those people that are putting up constellations today. And in terms of data centers, I think people confuse edge compute and data centers right now would be my observation.
Let's go. Okay.
Couple part questions, but I think it's kind of tied together, so I'll say it all. So thoughts on use we discussed earlier, where you balance between commercial then taking the government funding path. How is the government, in your view, on the recent bills and policies? What should be? What do you need to see?
Okay, so first question on thoughts on dual use and balance between government and commercial funding. So I'll deal with that one first. So point number one, every single business I've invested in is inherently dual use. It's just a feature of the space market. It's equally true that for most of those companies, but not all of them, government and defense and departments of defense are the first customer and the biggest customer. So if you're not playing to being able to supply the DOW, then that's an order of magnitude bigger customer than, depending on what you're doing, anything else out there. So government is super important for most of the businesses that we engage with. Our yet to be proven thesis is that over a longer term time horizon, in due course, going back to some of my earlier comments about now the advent of artificial intelligence, the fact that we have this ubiquitous connectivity and the diversity of all these sensing modalities, we actually think there is sort of a tsunami of disruption coming that is going to have a massive and very profound impact on lots of commercial domains, terrestrially and off-world, and that over an indeterminate time horizon, those commercial opportunities will eventually surpass government. It's not there yet. What do we as investors need to see from government? Like tangible and well-qualified demand signals is by far the most important thing. And what does that mean? Grants and support for really early stage R&D, super important, but I'm much more interested in actual contracts for delivery of capability, even if it's immature capability that has a sufficient fidelity of that initial contract leading sequentially over a more prolonged period of time to something that's more significant and repeatable.
At the market level or at the company level, like are you looking for that company to get stratified level before they invest or
a bit of both, and it depends on the segment and it depends on the stage of both the company and the area that they're playing to.
Sort of thing on that, do you perceive that regulation coming into this environment will make the opportunities bigger, or will it constrain that tsunami?
What are my thoughts on space regulation? Necessary to a point, but I've lost money on multiple occasions backing businesses that I thought were going to be enabled by regulation that has either then not manifested or manifested itself in a way that's actually singularly unhelpful. So I think, is there a regulatory deficit in parts of the space market? If you're looking at I guess anything to do with cislunar, if you're looking at anything to do with space-based traffic management, if you're looking at debris management, all of those areas, arguably there is a bit of a deficit in those areas. But look, it's in my job title. I'm a capitalist and therefore a free market capitalist at that. So I'm wary of over-regulation stymieing innovation. And I am a huge believer in the private sector driving innovation that benefits everyone. So I think the question is about in-space. Were they
assembly?
Thank you, and manufacturing. Yeah, we're at Seraphim. We're massive believers in the broader ISAM market, albeit at the moment probably focused on certain particular categories. So anyone doing interesting stuff exploiting microgravity, we think that is a super interesting area, principally for building stuff to bring back down to Earth, where there are some multi-trillion-dollar markets that we think across material science and life sciences, to name two very obvious areas, there's going to be some really fundamental innovation happening in space that is going to be incredibly impactful for bringing novel capabilities down to us. So this is an area that we've been investing in for the last couple of years, both in terms of the enabling technologies for getting stuff up and bringing it back down, for the proliferation of platforms, for actually being able to conduct not just R&D, but manufacturing in orbit, as well as the people actually developing capabilities. So good example, we recently invested in a company called Lambda Vision, which is developing artificial retinas in space. So space helping the blind see. That's the kind of opportunity that we like. In terms of the question being more orientated towards like building superstructures in space and the application of robotics being pretty central to that. I'm not sure the enabling technologies are quite there yet in terms of maturity to really be an unlock for that market. And we're a little bit hesitant. And I think this is a philosophical difference between us and some other investors in the space sector. I'm a bit wary of businesses that are entirely predicated on Starship being there and being there really soon. Not because I don't think Starship will be there, but I'm just not quite sure that the time horizons will necessarily be there to enable that quite as quickly as people think. So we like businesses that are looking to do bold, ambitious things and build big structures in space, but they have a business plan for being able to like develop in anticipation of Starship rather than having to wait for Starship to actually do anything.
Okay, great. Thanks, James. Just to check, where are we at with respect to 5 minutes? Okay, great. So going back, pulling on the thread a little bit more of the kind of the connective tissue piece. So from your perspective, do you see the future being that constellation operators will build the connective tissue because they have to? Or do you think there's room for a separate or a couple category leaders to come into the space literally and figuratively? Do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I don't think it will be a one size fits all is the honest answer. I think to this point, in terms of whatever capabilities a company has needed in order to both build and then operate large scale constellations, by and large, that has been done in-house. And I would say that generally over the last 10 years, we've had quite a strong preference for businesses that are very vertically integrated, borrowing, from the playbook of SpaceX. So the question is the sector now at a maturity point that actually it just doesn't make sense to keep reinventing the wheel for whatever capabilities it is around the operation of your constellation? And I think the honest answer to that depends. What's the use case? What's the customer? How sensitive are they going to be in terms of your reliance on third parties for doing things? In terms of more the orchestration piece, I think there is space in the market for specialist providers around that, particularly around the comm side, where you're effectively able to aggregate up all of the different forms of space-based connectivity, potentially creating quite an interesting marketplace, be that around actual spectrum or capacity. I think there are opportunities to build sizable businesses around that. And more intuitively, from our perspective, that seems like something that will be a necessary element of the market going forwards. Whereas other elements of sort of mission operations, I think it's less clear to us that there's a pathway for dedicated providers to sort of achieve the ubiquity that we would probably be needing to look for and to believe that you can build a venture scalable business within those categories.
Thank you. So you touched on this a little bit already, but so if a founder in this building or online was to approach you operating in this sector, so in 5 words, so what would you need to see to lean in versus pass from them? 5 words might be ambitious, but do your best or worst.
without resorting to sort of aphorisms. Well, it's like the 3 T's of team, tech, and traction. That's a really generic answer, but the reality is, any investor, first and foremost, it's about the team, understanding who it is that you're going to be backing, what experience they have, what vision, their personalities, the interplay between the team members. So that's pretty much top of the list. In terms of otherwise within this category, I've already alluded to it, but I think it's we want businesses that have the potential to, number one, be category leaders globally. We tend, certainly less true out in the US, but outside of the US, it's really hard to achieve venture scale if you're not going to be a category leader and you're not going to serve the market globally. So we tend not to be focused on people that are very regionally orientated. And I think it's about the scale of the business that you're able to build. So if you're a propulsion company or a component business, you're really going to have to convince us that what you're doing is so fundamentally better, like at least 10x better than anything else out there, that every single company that's going to be putting stuff into space is going to be needing your technology, because it's only through that ubiquity that you're probably going to be able to get the scale that makes the risk reward of us investing, particularly at very early stages, worthwhile.
All right, so we are at time. So I'm going to ask 2 quick-fire questions, and then maybe we'll have time for 2 quick-fire questions from the audience. What is the best way for founders to get in touch with you, the team? So kind of best practice for engaging with Seraphim. And then secondly, just what are you as James, a CIO, particularly excited by right now? It can be either within or external to the pLEO space.
The best way to get in touch with us, I mean, million one different ways. I would say key attribute of any successful entrepreneur, you've got to be really good networkers. And that's not to say like, we're not going to talk to you unless you can network your way to us and get an introduction, but like always be networking, because it's the analogy of always be fundraising. So yeah, there are lots of different ways to get in touch with us directly and indirectly. And we pride ourselves on wanting to talk to every single startup doing anything interesting space anywhere in the world. So please do come and talk to us. What are the areas that we're most interested in? I mean, I've kind of touched on it. I am very bullish about microgravity as being a huge enabler. And I think the necessary technologies that are going to make that possible, not at an R&D level, but at a manufacturing scale that meets the needs of the end applications. I think that's coming in the next 5 years, and I think that is going to profoundly change what people think of when they think of the space sector.
All right, last opportunity for any questions virtually or in person. Okay. James, thank you so much.
Thanks, Beth.
Yes.
Can you name a space company that you invested that you really in the last 10 years? Since, well, like the last, like since 2019.
Oh, my anti-portfolio list. Yeah, it's a good question. Which ones am I willing to admit to in public? So we're the world's most prolific space investor, and we're not invested in SpaceX. There are very good reasons for that. It's not because we don't think SpaceX are a phenomenal company. It's about the mandates of our investment funds. But look, they have an outsized influence over the space sector. So I wish I'd had the funds at the right time to get into to SpaceX. More broadly than that, you know, I'm pretty happy with most of the decisions that we've made, even where we've missed out. Not that we always get it right, but the reasons we've passed felt right at the time. So I try not to spend too much time beating myself up about the businesses I'm not in. I try and focus on helping the ones we are in.
It's a good life lesson for all of us. I'll take a page out of that book. All right, please join me in a round of applause for James. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined online. This concludes the pLEO Catalyst. And for all those in person, please do join us that way for food and beverages. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.